He found the cat inside his son's school backpack, and the reason broke his heart. The Colorado autumn light filtered through the kitchen curtains, painting golden rectangles on the worn linoleum floor. Harlan Foster stood at the counter, mechanically preparing his son's lunch. A peanut butter sandwich cut diagonally the way Lyle preferred, though the boy rarely ate more than a few bites these days. The clock on the wall ticked loudly in the quiet house, marking another Monday morning in Eldersbrook. "Lyle," Harlan called up the stairs, his voice echoing in the emptiness. "Bus will be here in 15 minutes. No answer came, which wasn't surprising. Since Ayla's death 2 years ago, their conversations had dwindled to necessities. Eat this, wear that, time for school, time for bed. The house that once bubbled with laughter and music now moved in silence, as if sound itself might disturb the fragile peace they'd constructed around their grief. Harlan packed the sandwich into the lunchbox, adding an apple and a small bag of pretzels. His hands moved with the practiced efficiency of routine, while his mind wandered to the stack of bills hidden in his desk drawer. The medical expenses from Ayla's illness had depleted their savings, and his job at the local hardware store barely covered the mortgage. But financial worries were easier to face than the hollow-eyed boy who appeared in the kitchen doorway, backpack already slung over his narrow shoulders. "Morning, buddy," Harlan said, forcing cheerfulness into his voice. "Got your math homework?" Lyle nodded, his eyes fixed on a point somewhere past his father. At 8 years old, he seemed both younger and impossibly older. Small for his age, with Ayla's delicate features and serious brown eyes that had seen too much. "Supposed to get cold later. Don't forget your jacket at school this time, okay?" Harlan held out the lunchbox and Lyle took it without a word, carefully placing it in his backpack. Before Ayla died, their mornings had been chaotic symphonies. Lyle racing around the house looking for lost sneakers, while Ayla called out reminders between sips of coffee, her long dark hair still damp from the shower, her laugh filling the kitchen when Harlan burned the toast again. Now efficiency had replaced joy, and Harlan sometimes wondered if this hollow routine was really living at all. As the yellow school bus pulled up outside, Harlan placed his hand briefly on Lyle's shoulder, the physical contact they'd reduced their relationship to. The boy didn't look up, just adjusted his backpack and walked toward the door. "Have a good day," Harlan called after him. The door closed without a response. Alone in the kitchen, Harlan poured another cup of coffee and stared out the window at the mountains rising beyond their small town. Eldersbrook, Colorado was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, where the general store still had a bulletin board covered with community announcements, and where neighbors brought casseroles when tragedy struck. For months after Ayla died, their freezer had been packed with other people's sympathy. But as time passed, the casseroles stopped coming, and the neighbors returned to their own lives, leaving Harlan and Lyle to figure out how to live with the space she'd left behind. Harlan sipped his coffee and mentally prepared for his shift at Pearson's Hardware. Tom Pearson had been understanding about his need for flexible hours during Ayla's illness, and he'd kept Harlan on even when grief made him forgetful and distracted. It wasn't the career Harlan had imagined for himself. Once he'd dreamed of opening his own custom furniture shop, but it paid the bills, mostly, and required little of the emotional energy he simply didn't have anymore. Before leaving, he straightened the kitchen and checked that he'd signed Lyle's reading log. His eyes caught on a photograph magnetized to the refrigerator, the three of them at Emerald Lake, Lyle sitting on Harlan's shoulders, both of them laughing as Ayla captured the moment. It had been taken 3 summers ago, before the headaches started, before the doctor's appointments, before the world tilted on its axis and never righted itself again. Harlan touched the edge of the photo, then turned away. Another day to get through, one foot in front of the other. That's what Dr. Chambers, the grief counselor, had told them. Just keep moving forward. But as he locked the front door behind him, Harlan couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't moving forward at all. They were simply existing, trapped in the amber of their grief, waiting for something, anything to change. What he didn't know was that change was already making its way home, tucked inside his son's school backpack, with golden eyes and a quiet determination that would transform their broken world. When Harlan returned home that evening, the house was quiet, which wasn't unusual. What was unusual was finding Lyle's backpack abandoned in the middle of the kitchen floor. Normally, the boy was methodical about hanging it on the designated hook in the hallway, one of the few routines he clung to since Ayla's death. "Lyle?" Harlan called, setting down the bag of groceries he'd picked up on the way home. "Everything okay?" The sound of running water came from the bathroom upstairs, followed by Lyle's voice, unnaturally high and quick. "I'll be down in a minute." Harlan frowned. Something about his son's tone triggered an alarm in his mind, the kind of parental intuition that had grown rusty with disuse over the past 2 years but hadn't disappeared entirely. He picked up the backpack, noticing immediately that it was heavier than usual. "Did you get extra homework today?" he called, unzipping the main compartment. What he found inside made him freeze in the middle of the kitchen. Between crumpled notebooks, an empty lunchbox, and a hastily folded jacket was a small grey cat, curled up and trembling. Its fur was dirty, matted in places, with darker patches mixed in and a distinctive white line running from its nose up to its forehead, like a birthmark. But it was the eyes that caught Harlan's attention, large, golden, and profoundly sad, staring up at him with a mixture of fear and resignation. "Lyle," Harlan murmured, still trying to process what he was seeing. The sound of small feet rushing down the stairs broke his trance. Lyle appeared in the doorway, his hands wet and a threadbare towel clutched in his fist. When he saw the open backpack in his father's hands, his shoulders slumped, and he looked at the floor waiting for the inevitable reprimand. "What is this?" Harlan asked, his voice carefully neutral. "Why is there a cat in your backpack?" The silence stretched between them, filling the kitchen with unspoken words. Finally Lyle spoke, his voice so soft Harlan had to lean forward to hear him. "I didn't want him to be taken away. He was alone, and he looked at me in a way I understood." The words landed like a stone in Harlan's chest. He knew that look. It was the same one he saw on his son's face every day since Ayla had passed away. 2 years ago, a sudden illness had taken her in less than a month, and their home in Eldersbrook had never been the same. Lyle had gone silent. He stopped drawing. He slept poorly, ate little, never spoke about his mother, never cried. He just carried a silence that no one knew how to reach. Harlan's first instinct was to say no, to return the cat to wherever it had come from. They could barely take care of themselves, let alone a stray animal. But as he watched Lyle approach cautiously, kneeling beside the backpack and gently stroking the cat's head with trembling fingers, something shifted inside him. This wasn't just a cat hidden in a backpack. It was a cry for help, a final gesture from a child who still hoped to be heard. "Where did you find it?" Harlan asked, setting the backpack down carefully on the kitchen table. Lyle kept his eyes on the cat, relief visible in the softening of his tense posture. "Behind the school shed." He was shivering between some boards and wet leaves. He paused, then added, "I've been feeding him parts of my lunch for 2 weeks. We just sit together. It's quiet." Harlan nodded, processing this information. So that's why Lyle's lunchbox had been coming home emptier lately. He'd assumed the boy's appetite was finally improving. And why today? Why bring him home now? Lyle's face clouded. "Mr. Jensen, the janitor, saw him yesterday. He said he was going to call animal control today because stray cats aren't allowed on school property." His voice broke slightly. "They would have taken him to the shelter, and Mrs. Perkins said in class that old animals don't get adopted from shelters. They get put to sleep." Harlan wasn't sure if that was entirely accurate. The cat looked young, possibly not even a year old, but he understood the fear driving his son's actions. In Lyle's 8-year-old mind, loss was permanent and absolute. Once something was gone, it never came back. "So I wrapped him in my sweater and put him in my backpack," Lyle continued, his words coming faster now. "He didn't even make a sound the whole way home. It's like he knew he needed to be quiet." The cat chose that moment to let out a small raspy meow, as if confirming Lyle's story. Despite himself, Harlan felt a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth, the first genuine one in what felt like forever. "Does he have a name?" he asked, surprising himself with the question. Lyle's head snapped up, his eyes wide with unexpected hope. "Brimley," he said immediately. "It's from that old book Mom used to read to me, about the lost cat who always found a home where you least expected it." Harlan's breath caught in his throat. It was the first time Lyle had mentioned Ayla out loud in months. The book had been one of her favorites, a worn paperback she'd treasured from her own childhood. Harlan had packed it away with her other things, unable to bear the sight of it on the bookshelf. He looked at the cat again, Brimley, who was now cautiously stretching in the backpack, seeming to sense the shift in the emotional weather of the room. The animal was painfully thin, its ribs visible beneath the dirty fur, and Harlan noticed a small cut on one ear that looked partially healed. The responsible thing would be to call animal control himself, or at least take the cat to a shelter where it could receive proper care. They weren't equipped for this, not financially, not emotionally. But as he watched Lyle gently lift Brimley from the backpack and cradle him against his chest, Harlan saw something he hadn't seen in 2 years, a flicker of life in his son's eyes. "He needs to see a vet," Harlan said finally. "If he's going to stay with us, even temporarily, we need to make sure he's healthy." Lyle's face transformed, hope blooming across his features like sunrise. "He can stay." "Really?" "For now," Harlan qualified, already wondering how they would afford vet bills on top of everything else. "But there are going to be rules and responsibilities. A pet is a big commitment." Lyle nodded solemnly, but the corners of his mouth turned up in what might have been the beginning of a smile. "I'll take care of him, Dad. I promise." Harlan watched as his son carried Brimley to the kitchen sink, talking softly to the cat as he wet a corner of the towel to clean its face. It was the most words Lyle had spoken at once in months, and the sound of his gentle voice filled the kitchen like music long forgotten. Outside, the first snowflakes of the season began to fall, dusting the windowsill with white. Inside, something equally delicate and unexpected was taking shape, a fragile bridge across the chasm of grief that had separated father and son for too long. Harlan turned to the groceries, unpacking them with renewed purpose. Whatever came next, they would face it together. For the first time in 2 years, the silent house in Eldersbrook held the faint but unmistakable promise of healing. The waiting room of Eldersbrook Veterinary Clinic smelled of antiseptic and dog treats. Harlan sat stiffly in a molded plastic chair, the cat carrier balanced on his knees. Inside, Brimley had retreated to the far corner, his golden eyes watching warily through the mesh door. Beside them, Lyle perched on the edge of his seat, his small body vibrating with anxiety. "What if he's really sick?" Lyle whispered, not for the first time since they'd arrived. "What if they can't help him?" Harlan placed a reassuring hand on his son's shoulder. "Doctor, Kesslin is the best vet in the county. If anyone can help Brimley, it's her." The truth was, Harlan had his own worries. He'd called ahead to explain their situation, carefully avoiding mentioning how they'd acquired the cat, and had been quoted a basic examination fee that already stretched his budget. If Brimley needed serious medical attention or medications, he wasn't sure how they'd manage it. "Mr. Foster?" A technician in blue scrubs appeared at the door. "Dr. Kesslin can see you now." Lyle jumped to his feet, and Harlan followed more slowly, cat carrier in hand. They were led to a small examination room with a metal table in the center. Charts showing feline anatomy decorated the mint-green walls, and a jar of treats sat on a counter beside various medical instruments. "You can let him out of the carrier," the technician said kindly. "Dr. Kesslin will be right with you." Harlan opened the carrier door, but Brimley made no move to emerge. After a moment of hesitation, Lyle knelt beside the carrier and spoke softly. "It's okay, Brimley. We're here to help you feel better. No one's going to hurt you." To Harlan's surprise, the cat crept forward at the sound of Lyle's voice, pausing at the carrier door before cautiously stepping onto the examination table. He remained close to the edge, his tail wrapped tightly around his paws, but he didn't try to run or hide. The door opened, and Dr. Kesslin entered, a woman in her 50s with salt and pepper hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. Harlan remembered her from community events. She'd been at the memorial service for Ayla, though they hadn't spoken directly. "So this is our new patient," she said, approaching the table slowly. "Hello there, little one." Dr. Kesslin moved with gentle efficiency, speaking in a calm, steady voice as she examined Brimley. She checked his eyes, ears, and mouth, felt along his ribcage and legs, and listened to his heart with a stethoscope. Throughout the examination, Brimley remained surprisingly still, only flinching when she touched a particularly tender spot on his right hind leg. "Well," she said, finally straightening up, "he's malnourished and dehydrated, as you suspected. There are some old wounds that have partially healed, that cut on his ear, and a few scrapes on his paws." His right hind leg shows signs of a minor sprain, but nothing's broken. He has some fleas, but no signs of serious parasites that I can detect without further testing. Is he going to be okay? Lyle asked, his voice small. Dr. Kesslin smiled at him. With proper care and patience, I think he has an excellent chance. He's young, probably around 8 months old, and despite everything, he seems to have a strong constitution. Relief washed over Lyle's face, and Harlan felt some of the tension leave his own shoulders. But then came the question he'd been dreading. We should run some blood tests to rule out any underlying issues, Dr. Kesslin continued. And he'll need vaccines, flea treatment, and eventually neutering. For today, I can give him some fluids, start him on a course of antibiotics for those wounds, and provide some special high-calorie food to help him gain weight. Harlan nodded, mentally calculating what this would mean for their already strained budget. Perhaps he could pick up an extra shift at the hardware store this weekend, or maybe it was time to finally sell Ayla's jewelry, something he'd been reluctant to do, saving it for Lyle when he was older. How much will all this cost? He asked quietly, hoping Lyle wouldn't notice the worry in his voice. Dr. Kesslin seemed to read something in his expression. She glanced at Lyle, who was gently stroking Brimley's head, then back at Harlan. "Why don't we step outside for a moment while my assistant prepares the fluids?" she suggested. In the hallway, Harlan braced himself for the estimate, already formulating apologies and alternatives in his mind. But Dr. Kesslin surprised him. "Harlan, it is Harlan, isn't it? I remember you from town events, though we haven't formally met. I was very sorry to hear about your wife." "Thank you," he replied automatically, the words worn smooth from repetition. She studied him for a moment, then said, "May I ask why this cat is so important? Most people wouldn't take in a stray in your circumstances." The question caught him off guard. He glanced through the small window in the door, where he could see Lyle sitting on the floor beside the examination table, looking up at Brimley and talking, his expression more animated than Harlan had seen in years. "Because that cat is saving my son," he said simply. "And maybe he's saving me too." Dr. Kesslin nodded, as if his answer confirmed something she'd already suspected. "We have a program here, the Rainbow Bridge Fund. It's for special cases, animals who make a difference in people's lives. I think Brimley qualifies." "I don't need charity," Harlan began, his pride stiffening his spine. "It's not charity," she interrupted gently. "It's community. We all remember Ayla. She volunteered at the summer reading program my niece attended. Always had a kind word for everyone." She paused. "The fund will cover today's visit and the basic medications. For the follow-up care, we can work out a payment plan that fits your budget." Harlan wanted to refuse, to insist they could manage on their own. That's what he'd been doing for 2 years, handling things, keeping it together, not asking for help. But he thought of Lyle's face when he'd asked if Brimley could stay, and he found himself nodding. "Thank you," he said, the words feeling rusty in his mouth. "I appreciate it more than I can say." When they returned to the examination room, the technician was showing Lyle how to hold a syringe of water so Brimley could drink more easily. The boy was focused intently on the task, his brow furrowed in concentration. "You're a natural," Dr. Kesslin said, watching him. "Brimley is lucky to have found you." Lyle looked up, a flash of something like pride crossing his face. "He found me," he corrected quietly. "I think he was looking for us." Dr. Kesslin smiled. "Animals have a way of knowing where they're needed." She turned to Harlan. "I'll have my assistant put together a care package for you, special food, medications, and some basic supplies to get you started. And I want to see Brimley back here in 2 weeks for a follow-up, sooner if you notice any problems." By the time they left the clinic, dusk was falling over Eldersbrook, painting the mountains purple against the darkening sky. Lyle carried the cat carrier carefully, peering inside every few steps to check on Brimley, who seemed more relaxed after receiving fluids and medication. "Dad," Lyle said as they walked toward the car, "thank you for letting me keep him." The simple gratitude in his son's voice made Harlan's throat tighten. "You're welcome, buddy, but remember, he's your responsibility now. That means feeding him, cleaning his litter box, making sure he's safe." Lyle nodded solemnly. "I will. I promise." He hesitated, then added, "Mom would have liked him, I think." The mention of Ayla, so casual and unexpected, nearly stopped Harlan in his tracks. For 2 years, They tiptoed around her name, as if speaking it might summon a grief too heavy to bear. But here was Lyle, bringing her into the conversation naturally, without the crushing weight of sadness that usually accompanied any reminder of her. Yes, Harlan agreed, his voice slightly hoarse. She would have loved him. She always had a soft spot for strays. As they drove home through the gathering darkness, Lyle kept one hand on the cat carrier, humming softly, a tune Harlan recognized with a start as one Ayla used to sing while cooking. He couldn't remember the last time he'd heard Lyle make any kind of music. At home they set up Brimley's new supplies in the kitchen, food and water bowls, a litter box in the corner, a small bed made from an old cushion. The cat explored cautiously, sniffing at furniture legs and doorways, mapping his new territory with deliberate care. Later, as Harlan stood in the doorway of Lyle's bedroom, he watched his son arrange his blankets, creating a special spot where Brimley could sleep beside him. The cat was already there, curled in a tight ball at the foot of the bed, his golden eyes half closed in contentment. "Good night, Dad," Lyle said, looking up with the ghost of a smile. "Good night, Brimley." "Good night, buddy," Harlan replied, his heart full with something that felt dangerously like hope. As he turned out the light and closed the door part way, he heard Lyle's voice, soft in the darkness, telling Brimley a story. The very story from which the cat had gotten his name. A story Ayla had read dozens of times, each word preserved in her son's memory like a precious artifact. In the quiet of the hallway, Harlan leaned against the wall and allowed himself, for the first time in a very long time, to cry. Not the harsh, choking sobs that had racked him in the early days of grief, but gentle tears of release, of gratitude for the small miracle that had arrived unexpected in his son's backpack. Outside, the first real snow of winter began to fall, covering Eldersbrook in a blanket of white, transforming the familiar landscape into something new and full of possibility. The following Saturday morning, Harlan woke to an unfamiliar sound, laughter. He lay still for a moment, convinced he must be dreaming. Then it came again, a clear, bright sound floating up the stairs from the living room below. Lyle's laughter, something he hadn't heard in so long that its absence had become normal, like the background hum of a refrigerator that's only noticed when it stops. Harlan pulled on his robe and padded downstairs, following the sound. In the living room, he found Lyle sitting cross-legged on the floor, dangling a piece of string for Brimley, who was batting at it with surprising energy for a cat who'd been half-starved just days ago. As the cat pounced and missed, tumbling dramatically onto his side, Lyle laughed again, the unguarded, spontaneous giggle of a child at play. "Morning," Harlan said softly, not wanting to break the spell. Lyle looked up, his smile fading slightly, but not disappearing entirely. Progress, Harlan thought. "Brimley likes to play," Lyle reported, as if this were extraordinary news. "Doctor, Kesslin said it's a good sign that he feels safe now." Harlan nodded, taking a seat on the couch to watch them. Brimley had already changed in the 5 days since they'd brought him home. His fur looked cleaner and less matted, his movements more fluid as the pain from his old injuries subsided. The special food from the vet was doing its work too. His ribs were less prominent, and his eyes looked brighter. But the most remarkable transformation wasn't in the cat at all. It was in Lyle. He was still quiet by most standards, still carried the solemn demeanor that had settled on him after Ayla's death. But there were moments, like now, when the old Lyle shone through, curious, engaged, capable of joy. "What do you say we make pancakes?" Harlan suggested, inspired by the moment. "Your mum's recipe with blueberries?" He waited for the familiar shadow to cross Lyle's face at the mention of Ayla, but instead the boy nodded eagerly. "Can we make extra for later?" "Sure," Harlan agreed, pleasantly surprised. "Come on, Chef Lyle, Brimley can supervise." In the kitchen they moved around each other with a new ease, Lyle measuring flour while Harlan mixed the batter. Brimley watched from the doorway, his tail twitching with interest at the activity. "Mom used to let me flip them," Lyle said suddenly, his hands covered in flour. "But I always made a mess." Harlan smiled, remembering Sunday mornings with pancake batter splattered across the stove, and Ayla laughing, saying it wasn't a proper weekend without at least one pancake on the ceiling. "Well, it's your turn to try again," he said, handing Lyle the spatula. "Just remember to wait for the bubbles before you flip." As they ate their slightly misshapen but delicious pancakes, Harlan noticed Lyle taking small bites of his food without prompting. Another change. For months after Ayla died, meals had become battlegrounds, with Lyle picking listlessly at his plate, while Harlan tried every trick to get him to eat more than a few mouthfuls. "I was thinking," Harlan said carefully, "maybe we could go to Willow Creek Park later. The weather's supposed to clear up and you haven't been on the swings in a while." Lyle considered this. His fork paused halfway to his mouth. "Can Brimley come?" It wasn't the response Harlan had expected. "Cats don't usually like parks, buddy. And he's still recovering. I think he'd be happier here, resting." Disappointment flickered across Lyle's face. But he'd be all alone. Harlan recognized the real concern beneath the words. Being alone was Lyle's greatest fear, the unspoken anxiety that had haunted him since Ayla's death. In his 8-year-old mind, people who were left alone disappeared forever. "Tell you what," Harlan said, struck by sudden inspiration. "We'll go to the park for just an hour and then we'll stop by Henderson's on the way back and get Brimley a proper cat bed and some toys. How does that sound?" Lyle's expression brightened. "And maybe a collar. A blue one, like the color of Mom's favorite coffee mug." "A blue collar it is," Harlan agreed, his heart lifting at this casual reference to Ayla, offered without pain. After breakfast, Lyle insisted on making sure Brimley had fresh water and comfortable places to nap while they were gone. Harlan watched as his son carefully arranged a small blanket in a patch of sunlight by the living room window, explaining to the cat exactly when they would return. "We won't be gone long," Lyle promised, stroking Brimley's head, "and we'll bring you presents." The cat blinked slowly in response, a gesture that Dr. Kesslin had told them was a sign of trust and affection among felines. Lyle beamed, interpreting it as understanding. At the park, the November air was crisp but not bitter, the lingering snow from earlier in the week melting in patches of sunshine. Lyle headed straight for the swings, an activity he'd once loved but had shown no interest in since Ayla's passing. Harlan pushed him gently, the familiar rhythm returning to his arms, as if no time had passed. "Hiya, Dad," Lyle called, and Harlan obliged, marveling at the simple normalcy of the moment. They stayed longer than the planned hour, Lyle rediscovering the playground with growing enthusiasm. He climbed the monkey bars, slid down the twisty slide, and even joined an impromptu game of tag with some other children who arrived with their parents. Watching from a bench, Harlan felt a presence beside him and looked up to see Eleanor Whitman, Lyle's second-grade teacher, settling next to him with a smile. "Mr. Foster," she greeted him warmly. "It's good to see Lyle playing with the other children." Harlan nodded, returning her smile. "It's been a while." Ms. Whitman had been one of the few constants in Lyle's life during the darkest days after Ayla's death. When he'd stopped participating in class, stopped doing his homework, stopped speaking to his classmates, she'd been patient and understanding, never pushing, but never giving up either. "I've noticed some changes this week," she said, watching as Lyle chased a boy in a red jacket around the climbing structure. "He raised his hand in math class yesterday, first time all year, and he brought in his reading log completely filled out. We have a new family member," Harlan explained, "a cat named Brimley. Lyle found him at school and, well, it's a long story, but he seems to be making a difference." Ms. Whitman's eyes crinkled with understanding. "Animals have a special way of healing broken hearts. My grandmother used to say they speak the language of the soul. No words needed." They sat in companionable silence, watching Lyle play. After a while, Ms. Whitman spoke again, her tone gentle but direct. "The school counselor mentioned that Lyle hasn't been attending his grief support group sessions. I know those things can feel artificial, but they really do help children process their feelings." Harlan sighed, guilt settling over him like a familiar coat. He refused to go after the first few times, said it made him feel worse, not better. "I didn't have the heart to force him." "Of course," she said quickly. "Every child grieves differently. I just wanted to make sure you knew about the options." She paused, then added, "There's also a parent group that meets at the community center on Thursday evenings. Several single parents attend." Harlan nodded non-committally. The thought of sitting in a circle sharing his pain with strangers made his chest tighten. He'd tried it once, shortly after Ayla died, and had left halfway through, unable to breathe through the suffocating weight of collective grief. "I'll think about it," he said, knowing he probably wouldn't. Ms. Whitman seemed to understand. She stood, adjusting her scarf against the chill. "Well, whatever you're doing with Lyle now, it seems to be working. He drew a picture in art class yesterday, first one since, in a long time. It was of a cat with golden eyes sitting on a windowsill. There was so much detail, so much care in it. It reminded me of how he used to draw before." Her words stayed with Harlan as they left the park and headed to Henderson's general store, where Lyle carefully selected a round cat bed with plush sides, so Brimley can feel safe, 3 different toys, for when he gets bored, and a blue collar with a small bell, so we always know where he is. At the checkout counter, Agnes Henderson, who had owned the store with her husband for as long as anyone in Eldersbrook could remember, smiled at Lyle's selections. "Looks like someone has a new pet," she remarked, ringing up their purchases. "His name is Brimley," Lyle informed her seriously. "He was lost, but now he lives with us." "Is that so?" Agnes replied, her eyes twinkling. "Well, I've always believed that the best family members are the ones who find us, not the other way around." As they walked home, Lyle clutched the bag of cat supplies with both hands. His earlier worry about leaving Brimley alone transformed into excitement about showing him the new treasures. Halfway there, fat snowflakes began to fall, dusting their shoulders and catching in Lyle's dark hair. "Look, Dad," he exclaimed, tilting his face to the sky. "It's like the snow in Mum's snow globe, the one from her grandma." Harlan felt his heart constrict at the memory. The snow globe had been one of Ayla's prized possessions, a glass sphere containing a tiny reproduction of her childhood home in Vermont. It had sat on their mantelpiece until the day after her funeral, when Lyle had accidentally knocked it off while reaching for a photograph. The glass had shattered, the water and fake snow spilling across the hardwood floor. Lyle had been inconsolable, convinced he'd destroyed one of the last pieces of his mother. Harlan had cleaned up the mess and stored the broken pieces in a box, intending to try to repair it someday, but never finding the emotional strength to do so. "Yes," he agreed, his voice slightly rough. Just like that. They hurried the rest of the way home, the snow falling more heavily around them, transforming Eldersbrook into a winter wonderland. When they opened the front door, they found Brimley waiting for them in the entryway, as if he'd sensed their approach. "Brimley!" Lyle dropped to his knees, setting the bag of supplies down. "We got you presents. And I went on the swings and played tag and saw Miss Whitman. And we're making spaghetti for dinner because it's Saturday." The words tumbled out in a rush, and Harlan stood still, absorbing the sound of his son's voice, animated, excited, alive. Brimley weaved between Lyle's knees, purring loudly enough to be heard across the room. Harlan hung up their coats and watched as Lyle arranged Brimley's new bed in the corner of the living room, demonstrating each toy with solemn instructions on how they worked. The cat batted at a feathered wand with surprising dexterity, sending Lyle into fits of giggles. Later, as promised, they made spaghetti together, another of Ayla's recipes with extra garlic in the sauce the way she'd always made it. For the first time in months, Lyle ate a full plate without prompting, and even asked for seconds. That night, as Harlan passed Lyle's bedroom on his way to bed, he paused at the partially open door. Inside, his son was asleep, one arm flung across the pillow, his face peaceful in the soft glow of the nightlight. Brimley was curled against his side, the new blue collar standing out against his grey fur, his golden eyes half closed in contentment. The scene struck Harlan with such poignant simplicity that he had to lean against the doorframe for support. Here was everything that mattered in his world, everything worth fighting for, contained in this small, quiet moment. "Thank you," he whispered, not sure if he was addressing the cat or Ayla's memory or some higher power he'd stopped believing in 2 years ago. "Thank you for finding us." As if in answer, Brimley opened his eyes fully and blinked slowly at Harlan, before settling back against Lyle with a soft sigh. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering Eldersbrook in a blanket of white, transforming the familiar into something new, something full of possibility. Inside, in a house that had been too quiet for too long, small awakenings were taking place, in a boy and a father, and in the spaces between them where grief had once seemed insurmountable. December arrived with a vengeance, bringing the first major snowstorm of the season. The forecast had promised 8 inches, but by midnight nearly a foot of snow had fallen, with more expected through the night. Harlan woke to the sound of wind rattling the windows and the muffled quiet that only comes with heavy snowfall. He checked his phone to find a text message from Tom Pearson. "Store closed today. Roads impassable. Stay safe. A snow day then." Harlan felt a small ripple of relief. The extra day's pay would have been welcome, but the thought of an unexpected day at home with Lyle held its own appeal. Things had been steadily improving since Brimley's arrival 3 weeks earlier. Lyle was talking more, eating better, even bringing home homework that had actually been completed. Last week he'd volunteered to read aloud in class, a small miracle that Ms. Whitman had called specifically to share. Harlan padded to the window and pulled back the curtain. The world outside was transformed, buried under pristine white. The neighbor's fence was barely visible, and the road was nothing more than a vague depression in the snow-covered landscape. The sky was the color of brushed steel, promising more snow to come. He made his way downstairs, expecting to find Lyle still asleep. Instead, he discovered his son in the kitchen, carefully measuring cat food into Brimley's bowl while the cat wound figure eights around his ankles. "Morning, buddy," Harlan said, hiding his surprise. "You're up early." Lyle looked up, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Brimley was hungry. "And I saw the snow. Is my school closed?" "I haven't checked, but I'm guessing yes. Looks like we're snowed in." A flicker of something, excitement, crossed Lyle's face. "Can we make snow angels? And hot chocolate with the little marshmallows?" The question caught Harlan off guard. Snow angels and hot chocolate had been Ayla's winter traditions. On the first big snow of every season, she'd bundle Lyle up and take him out to make snow angels in the backyard, followed by hot chocolate with tiny marshmallows that she kept hidden in the back of the pantry, specifically for these occasions. Last winter, their first without her, Harlan had avoided any mention of the tradition, and Lyle hadn't asked. "I think we still have some marshmallows," Harlan said carefully, testing the emotional waters. "And I bet the snow is perfect for angels right now." Lyle nodded, seeming satisfied with this answer, and returned to his task of feeding Brimley. The cat ate eagerly, his once bony frame now filling out with proper nutrition and care. The cut on his ear had healed completely, and his fur had grown thicker with the approaching winter, making the white line on his face stand out even more dramatically against the grey. After breakfast, they bundled up in winter gear, snow pants, boots, heavy coats, scarves and mittens. Brimley watched their preparations with feline curiosity from his perch on the windowsill, his favourite spot for observing the world outside. "Will Brimley be okay alone?" Lyle asked, zipping up his coat. The question contained echoes of his old anxiety about separation, but without the panicked edge it once held. "He'll be fine," Harlan assured him. "Cats like to stay warm and dry. We won't be gone long." The blast of cold air that greeted them as they stepped onto the porch took Harlan's breath away. The snow was deeper than it had looked from the window, nearly reaching Lyle's knees in some places. They waded through the drifts to the middle of the backyard, where the snow lay smooth and undisturbed. "Remember how to make a snow angel?" Harlan asked. Lyle nodded, but hesitated, looking uncertain. "Mum always went first. She said she was making a path for me to follow." Harlan felt his throat tighten at the memory, Ayla laughing as she fell backward into fresh snow, her dark hair fanning out around her head, her arms and legs sweeping back and forth to create the perfect angel shape. "Well," he said, finding his voice, "I guess it's my job now." He took 2 steps forward and let himself fall backward into the snow, the impact softer than he expected. The cold immediately seeped through his layers, but he ignored it, moving his arms and legs to create the angel's wings and robes. Above him, the grey sky seemed closer somehow, heavy with more snow yet to fall. "Now you," he called to Lyle, who was watching with wide eyes. After a moment's hesitation, Lyle fell backward into the snow beside him, a small oof escaping as he landed. Then, tentatively at first, he began to move his arms and legs, creating his own snow angel next to Harlan's. They lay there side by side, moving in synchrony, their breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. The moment held a strange, crystalline perfection. Father and son making snow angels under a winter sky, carrying on a tradition that had seemed lost forever. "Mom would like this," Lyle said suddenly, his voice clear in the muffled quiet of the snow-covered yard. "She always said snow angels were messages to heaven." Harlan turned his head to look at his son, surprised by the absence of pain in his words. "She did say that, didn't she? I'd forgotten." Lyle nodded, his face solemn but not sad. She said when you make a snow angel, you're leaving an imprint of joy for others to find. Like a message saying, someone was happy here. The simple wisdom of it, Ayla's wisdom, preserved in her son's memory, made Harlan's eyes sting with sudden tears that the cold air quickly froze on his lashes. He blinked them away before Lyle could notice. Your mum was pretty smart, he said, his voice rough with emotion. Yeah, Lyle agreed matter-of-factly. That's why she was a librarian, because she knew about all the best stories. Before Ayla's illness, she'd worked part-time at the Eldersbrook Public Library, organizing children's reading programs and community events. Her storytelling sessions had been legendary among the town's children, who would sit cross-legged on the colorful rug in the children's section, mesmerized by her animated retellings of classic tales. Carefully, they stood up from their snow angels, taking care not to disturb their creations. Standing side by side, they admired their work. One large angel and one small one, their wingtips almost touching. Perfect, Harlan declared, placing his arm around Lyle's shoulders. Ready for that hot chocolate? Inside, they shed their snow-covered layers in the mudroom and padded in sock feet to the kitchen. Brimley greeted them with interested sniffs, apparently intrigued by the unfamiliar scent of snow they brought in with them. As Harlan heated milk on the stove, Lyle rummaged in the back of the pantry, emerging triumphantly with the bag of tiny marshmallows Harlan had bought last year but never used. Found them, he announced, holding them up like a trophy. They carried their steaming mugs to the living room window, where they could watch the continuing snowfall while staying warm. Brimley joined them, jumping onto the windowsill to observe the white landscape with feline fascination. Look, Lyle said, pointing. You can still see our snow angels from here. Sure enough, the two angel shapes were visible in the backyard, already being softened by fresh snowfall, but still distinctly there. Two imprints of joy, as Ayla would have said, marking their presence in the world. As they sipped their hot chocolate, the lights flickered once, twice, and then went out completely, plunging the house into sudden dimness. Dad? Lyle's voice held a note of alarm. It's okay, Harlan reassured him. Just a power outage from the storm. The emergency lights will come on in a second. As if on cue, the battery-powered emergency lights they'd installed after last winter's big storm flickered to life, casting a soft glow throughout the main floor. Brimley seemed unperturbed by the change, continuing his window surveillance with undiminished interest. Will we be cold? Lyle asked, a thread of worry in his voice. Nah, Harlan said confidently. We've got the wood stove, plenty of blankets and each other. We'll be fine until the power company fixes the lines. In truth, he wasn't sure how long the outage would last. Winter storms in Eldersbrook could knock out power for hours or even days, especially when the roads were too snow-covered for repair crews to get through easily. But they were prepared. He'd made sure of that after last year's 3-day outage had caught them without enough firewood or non-perishable food. They spent the morning playing board games by the light of the emergency lamps and the warm glow of the wood stove, which Harlan kept well stocked with seasoned logs from the covered pile on the back porch. Brimley divided his time between watching the snow and curling up near the stove, clearly appreciating its radiant heat. By mid-afternoon, the storm showed no signs of abating, and the house was growing noticeably cooler, except for the living room where the wood stove provided steady warmth. Harlan checked his phone to find a message from the power company estimating restoration times of 24 to 48 hours for their area. Looks like we might be camping out in the living room tonight, he told Lyle, who was teaching Brimley to bat a crumpled paper ball back and forth across the floor. The bedrooms will be too cold without heat. Instead of showing concern, Lyle's face lit up. Like a sleepover? Can we build a fort with blankets? Harlan laughed, surprised by his son's enthusiasm. Sure, why not? Let's gather all the blankets and pillows we can find. They spent the next hour transforming the living room into a cozy fortress, draping blankets over chairs and the couch to create a tent-like structure centered around the warmth of the wood stove. Harlan made sure to keep a safe distance between their construction and the heat source, ever mindful of safety. Inside their blanket fort, they arranged sleeping bags, pillows, and more blankets, creating a nest that Brimley immediately approved of, kneading the soft surfaces with his paws before settling in the center with a contented purr. He thinks it's a giant cat bed, Lyle giggled, the sound warming Harlan's heart more effectively than any wood stove could. As darkness fell outside, the snow continued to swirl past the windows, illuminated by the glow of their emergency lights. Harlan prepared a simple dinner of canned soup heated on the wood stove, served with crackers and peanut butter, which they ate inside their fort like explorers on an Arctic expedition. "This is the best snow day ever," Lyle declared, licking peanut butter from his fingers. "Even better than when school got cancelled for a whole week in kindergarten." Harlan smiled, remembering that week. Ayla had been pregnant with their second child then, a pregnancy that had ended in miscarriage just days after the snow melted. They'd never told Lyle about the baby they'd lost. At 5, he'd been too young to understand. Sometimes Harlan wondered if things would have been different if that child had lived, if Ayla's death would have been easier to bear, with another piece of her still present in their lives. "Dad?" Lyle's voice pulled him back from his thoughts. "Can you tell me a story, like Mom used to?" The request, so simple and yet so loaded with meaning, caught Harlan off guard. Ayla had been the storyteller in their family. He'd always been the one who built things, fixed things, made things work. Stories had been her domain. "I'm not very good at making up stories," he admitted. "Not like your mum was." Lyle considered this, his small face serious in the flickering light. "You could tell me a true story then, about when you and Mum were younger." Something shifted in Harlan's chest, a loosening, a warming. For so long he'd avoided talking about Ayla, afraid that memories would only deepen the pain of her absence. But sitting here in their makeshift fort, with the storm raging outside and their small family, himself, Lyle, and now Brimley, safe and warm within, the prospect of sharing stories about her felt not painful, but healing. "Did I ever tell you about the time your mum and I got lost hiking in the mountains?" he began, settling back against the pillows. Lyle shook his head, eyes wide with anticipation, and moved closer, leaning against Harlan's side. Brimley, sensing the shift in energy, stretched and then relocated to Lyle's lap, curling into a grey ball of contentment. Harlan began the story, how he and Ayla, dating for just 6 months, had set out on what was supposed to be a simple day hike that turned into an overnight adventure when they missed a trail marker and took a wrong turn. How they'd found shelter in a small cave as darkness fell. How Ayla, always prepared, had produced a chocolate bar from her backpack that they'd shared square by square to keep their spirits up. She wasn't even scared, Harlan recalled, smiling at the memory. She said, "Well, at least we're lost together, which is better than being lost alone." And then she told ghost stories until I forgot to be worried. Lyle listened, rapt, as the tale unfolded. How they'd been found the next morning by a search party organized by worried friends. How Ayla had apologized to the rescuers for the trouble, but then invited them all to breakfast at the local diner, turning the whole misadventure into a celebration. "That's how your mum was," Harlan said softly. "She could find the bright side of anything, even getting lost in the mountains." "Even getting sick?" Lyle asked, his voice small but steady. The question hung in the air between them, heavy with all the conversations they'd never had, all the emotions they'd never expressed. Harlan took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "Even then," he said finally. "She was scared and sad about leaving us, but she still found moments to smile, to laugh, to make sure we knew how much she loved us. That was her gift, finding light even in the darkest places." Lyle nodded slowly, processing this. Brimley, as if sensing the emotional weight of the moment, began to purr more loudly, the vibration traveling through Lyle's small body where the cat lay. "I think that's why Brimley found us," Lyle said after a long pause. "Because we needed to remember how to find the light." The simple wisdom of the statement, so like something Ayla might have said, left Harlan momentarily speechless. He pulled his son closer, pressing a kiss to the top of his head, breathing in the familiar scent of his shampoo mixed with the wood smoke from the stove. "I think you might be right," he managed finally. Outside, the storm continued to rage, wind howling around the corners of the house, and snow piling ever higher against the windows. Inside their blanket fort, illuminated by the warm glow of emergency lights and the flickering flames visible through the wood stove's glass door, father and son and cat huddled together, creating a small island of warmth and connection in the midst of winter's fury. As Lyle's eyelids grew heavy with approaching sleep, Harlan continued to tell stories, small everyday memories of Ayla that he'd kept locked away for too long. The time she'd tried to bake a birthday cake for Harlan and forgot the sugar completely. The way she sang off-key in the shower every morning. How she'd insisted on dancing in the rain during summer thunderstorms, pulling Harlan and Lyle outside to join her. With each story, he felt something shift within him. Not the sharp pain of loss that had been his constant companion for 2 years, but something gentler, almost sweet. The realization that in sharing these memories with Lyle, Ayla wasn't fading away, but becoming more present, her spirit alive in the stories they told, in the traits Lyle had inherited from her, in the values and traditions they continued to honor. As Lyle finally drifted off to sleep, Brimley still purring on his chest, Harlan gazed at them through tear-blurred eyes. The cat's golden gaze met his, steady and somehow knowing, as if to say, "Yes, this is why I'm here. This is what healing looks like." Outside, the first storm of winter transformed their world, erasing familiar landmarks and creating new landscapes of pristine white. Inside, another transformation was taking place, slower, less visible, but no less profound. In a makeshift fort built of blankets and memories, surrounded by the howling wind and drifting snow, a broken family was finding its way back to wholeness, one story, one purr, one shared moment at a time. The Monday after the great snowstorm, Lyle came home from school clutching a wrinkled piece of paper with an unusual expression on his face, something between excitement and apprehension. Harlan, who had taken to meeting the school bus at the end of their driveway, noticed it immediately. "Everything okay, buddy?" he asked, as they crunched through the snow toward the house, where paths had been shoveled, but snowbanks still rose higher than Lyle's head on either side. "We have to do a family project," Lyle said, holding out the paper, "about traditions and special things our family does." Harlan took the paper, scanning it quickly. "Winter Traditions Family Project," the heading read, followed by instructions for students to create a presentation about their family's unique winter traditions. The project would culminate in a winter celebration evening, where families would share their traditions through displays, performances, or demonstrations. His heart sank slightly. Before Ayla's death, they'd had plenty of winter traditions: cookie-baking marathons, homemade ornaments, carols singing at the retirement home, midnight sledding on Christmas Eve. But in the 2 years since, those traditions had fallen away, too painful to continue without her. "What do you think?" he asked carefully, watching Lyle's face. "Do we still have winter traditions?" Lyle kicked at a chunk of snow, considering. "Ms. Whitman said traditions can be new too. They don't have to be old to count." They reached the front porch where Brimley was waiting in the window, his grey face pressed against the glass. The sight made both of them smile. It had become the cat's habit to watch for their return each afternoon. "Well," Harlan said, unlocking the door, "we could talk about our snow angels. That's a tradition your mum started that we're continuing." Lyle nodded, but seemed hesitant. "Jessica Peterson is bringing her grandma's special hot chocolate recipe that's been in her family for 80 years. And Michael Wilson's family does this thing where they make ice lanterns and put them all around their yard." The unspoken message was clear. Lyle wanted something special, something that would stand out among his classmates' presentations, something he could be proud of. Brimley greeted them at the door, weaving between their legs as they stomped snow from their boots in the entryway. In the weeks since his arrival, he'd transformed from the skinny, frightened creature they'd found in Lyle's backpack into a confident, affectionate cat who seemed to consider himself an essential part of their daily routines. As Lyle hung up his coat, a thought struck Harlan. What about Brimley? Finding him was pretty special. And taking care of him together is kind of a new tradition we're starting. Lyle's face brightened momentarily, then fell. "But that's not really a winter tradition, and everyone already knows about Brimley because I told them in show and tell." Harlan nodded, understanding. "Let's think about it over dinner. Maybe something will come to us." Later, as they ate spaghetti at the kitchen table, Brimley observing hopefully from a nearby chair, Harlan noticed Lyle pushing the pasta around his plate rather than eating it, a throwback to his behavior in the months after Ayla's death. "Still thinking about the project?" Harlan asked gently. Lyle nodded, his fork scraping patterns in the sauce. "Caitlin's mum is coming to show everyone how to make paper snowflakes like they do in Denmark, because that's where her great-grandmother came from." He paused, then added quietly, "Most of the kids have mums helping with their projects." The simple statement hit Harlan like a physical blow. Of course, this wasn't just about finding a tradition to share. It was about the painful reality that Lyle would be the only child without a mother present at the winter celebration evening. "I know I'm not Mom," Harlan said carefully, "but I promise we'll come up with something really special for your project. Something that honors her memory, too." Lyle looked up, his eyes serious. "Like what?" Harlan thought for a moment, casting his mind back to winters before Ayla's illness. What traditions had been uniquely theirs, not borrowed from either of their families or common to everyone in town? And then he remembered the star jars. "Your mum had this tradition," he began slowly. "Something her father taught her when she was about your age. Every winter solstice, that's the longest night of the year, they would make star jars to help bring back the light." Lyle leaned forward, interest flickering across his face. "Star jars? What are those?" "They're like little contained galaxies," Harlan explained, warming to the memory. "You take mason jars and paint them dark blue or purple inside. Then you poke tiny holes in the metal lids, different constellations for each jar. You put a small light inside, and when you turn off all the other lights, the stars shine on your walls and ceiling." "Like a planetarium?" Lyle asked. Harlan nodded. "Exactly. Your mum's dad was an amateur astronomer. He taught her all about the constellations, and she taught us. Remember how we used to go stargazing on clear summer nights?" Lyle's eyes widened with recognition. "And Mum would tell stories about the stars, like Orion the Hunter and the Seven Sisters." "The Pleiades," Harlan corrected gently. "Yes, that's right. After your grandfather died, your mum kept the tradition going. We made star jars every winter solstice and kept them lit all night to help bring back the sun. It was her way of remembering her dad and celebrating the return of longer days." Lyle was fully engaged now, his spaghetti forgotten. "Could we make them?" "For my project?" "We absolutely could," Harlan confirmed, relief washing through him. "We have some mason jars in the basement, and I'm pretty sure we still have the star maps your mum used somewhere in her office." Ayla's office, the small spare room upstairs that had once been her sanctuary, had remained largely untouched since her death. Harlan had closed the door on her books, her papers, her half-finished projects, unable to face sorting through them, but equally unable to remove them. It was, he realized with a pang, another way he'd been avoiding the pain of her absence. "Can we look now?" Lyle asked, already pushing back from the table. "Finish your dinner first," Harlan said automatically, then softened at Lyle's impatient expression. "Tell you what, 3 more bites and then we'll go exploring." After dinner, they climbed the stairs to the second floor, Brimley trotting ahead of them as if leading the way. At the closed door of Ayla's office, Harlan hesitated, his hand on the doorknob. He couldn't remember the last time he'd entered this room, probably not since those first dark days after the funeral, when he'd come looking for her insurance documents and had ended up sitting on the floor surrounded by her things, paralyzed by grief. "Dad?" Lyle's voice was quiet, uncertain. Harlan took a deep breath and turned the knob. The door swung open on silent hinges, revealing a room frozen in time. Dust motes danced in the late afternoon light streaming through the curtains Ayla had sewn herself, midnight blue fabric scattered with silver stars. Her desk stood by the window, piled with books and papers. Bookshelves lined one wall, filled with her eclectic collection of novels, poetry, astronomy guides, and children's literature. A comfortable reading chair occupied one corner, a half-finished Afghan draped over its arm. The air felt still, but not oppressive, more like the quiet of a library than the heaviness of a mausoleum. It smelled faintly of the lavender sachets Ayla had kept in her desk drawers, a scent that instantly transported Harlan back to happier times. Lyle stepped inside tentatively, his eyes wide as he took in the room. "It still looks like Mom's," he whispered, somewhere between a question and a statement. "Yes," Harlan acknowledged. I didn't know what to do with her things." Lyle nodded as if this made perfect sense and moved further into the room. Brimley followed, jumping lightly onto the desk and sniffing curiously at the pens in a ceramic holder Lyle had made in kindergarten. "Where would the star maps be?" Lyle asked, running his fingers along the spines of books on the nearest shelf. Harlan thought for a moment. "Probably in the bottom drawer of her desk." "That's where she kept special projects." Together they approached the desk. Harlan pulled open the bottom drawer, revealing folders neatly labeled in Ayla's flowing handwriting. Garden plans, house projects, Lyle's school memories, and near the back, Winter solstice. Here we go, Harlan said, pulling out the folder with a mixture of apprehension and anticipation. Inside were several sheets of paper, star maps with constellations clearly marked, instructions for making the jars, and photographs of completed projects from years past. Look, Lyle said, pointing to one photo. That's me. I was little. The picture showed a much younger Lyle, maybe 4 years old, his face illuminated by the starlight from a jar, wonder written across his features. Beside him, Ayla knelt, her arm around his shoulders, her smile radiant as she pointed to the constellation patterns projected on the wall. That was your first year helping make the jars, Harlan said, memories flooding back. You insisted on doing Ursa Major, the Great Bear, because it was the only constellation you could recognize in the real sky. Lyle studied the photograph intently, his fingers tracing his mother's face. I remember, he said softly. Mom let me use her special blue paint. They spent the next hour going through the folder, finding more photographs, reading Ayla's notes on which constellations worked best, and making lists of supplies they would need. Brimley remained on the desk, occasionally batting at pencils or paper clips, but mostly watching with feline curiosity as this new activity unfolded. The tension that had gripped Harlan upon entering the room gradually eased. Being surrounded by Ayla's things, far from deepening his grief, felt oddly comforting, as if her presence lingered in the room, benevolent and encouraging. The realization startled him. This was the first time since her death that remembering her felt more like a blessing than a wound. Can we start making the jars tomorrow? Lyle asked as they finally gathered the materials they wanted to take downstairs. The project is due next Monday, and we need time for the paint to dry. Absolutely, Harlan agreed. I'll stop by the hardware store after work and pick up any supplies we're missing. As they left the room, Harlan paused in the doorway, looking back at the space that had been Ayla's sanctuary. Instead of closing the door firmly as he had for 2 years, he left it slightly ajar, an acknowledgement that it was time to let Ayla's memory breathe, to let it become part of their daily lives again, rather than a sealed-off shrine to their loss. Over the next few days, their house transformed into a star jar workshop. The kitchen table became a painting station, where they carefully coated the insides of mason jars with deep blue paint mixed with tiny dots of white and silver to represent distant galaxies. The living room floor became a constellation planning area, where they spread out star maps and decided which patterns to feature in each jar. Brimley inserted himself into the process with typical feline determination, leaving paw prints in wet paint, batting at pencils as they marked constellations, and occasionally knocking over jars that weren't sufficiently weighted. Far from being frustrating, his antics made them laugh, a sound that filled the house more frequently with each passing day. On Thursday evening, as they worked on poking constellation patterns into the jar lids using Ayla's diagrams as guides, Lyle looked up from his careful work on the Pleiades. Dad, do you think Mum would like that we're making star jars again? Harlan set down the nail he'd been using to create Cassiopeia's distinctive W shape. I think she'd love it. This was one of her favorite traditions. Lyle nodded, satisfied with this answer. After a moment, he spoke again. Brimley helps me remember her sometimes. Is that weird? Not weird at all, Harlan assured him. How does he help you remember? Lyle considered this, his small face serious. He sits with me when I'm sad, just like Mum used to. And he doesn't need me to talk, he just stays. He paused, then added, but he also makes me laugh like Mom did, and he sleeps on her sweater that I keep under my pillow. The simple observation, offered without drama or excess emotion, struck Harlan deeply. All this time he'd been trying to protect Lyle from the pain of remembering Ayla, not realizing that his son had found his own way to keep her memory alive, not as something painful to avoid, but as a comfort to embrace. Your mom would really like Brimley, Harlan said, his voice slightly rough. She always had a soft spot for strays and lost things. That's why she married you, right? Lyle asked innocently. You told me once that you were kind of lost when she found you. Harlan laughed, surprised by his son's memory. That's right. I was working dead-end jobs, not sure what I wanted to do with my life. Your mum saw something in me that I couldn't see myself. He smiled at the memory. She had a gift for that, seeing the best in people, helping them find their way. They worked in companionable silence for a while, the only sounds the soft scrape of nails against metal lids and Brimley's occasional purr as he weaved between them. When all 5 jars were completed, their lids perforated with careful constellations, they arranged them on the kitchen counter to await their first lighting. "The winter solstice isn't until next week," Lyle observed. "But could we light one tonight, just to test it?" "I don't see why not," Harlan agreed. "Which constellation should we try first?" Without hesitation, Lyle pointed to the jar whose lid was pierced with the pattern of Ursa Major, the same constellation he'd chosen for his first star jar all those years ago. "This one." They placed a small battery-operated candle inside the jar, secured the perforated lid, and turned off all the lights in the kitchen. Instantly, the darkened room was transformed. Tiny pinpricks of light spilled from the jar, projecting the pattern of the Great Bear onto the walls and ceiling. The effect was magical, just as Harlan remembered, creating the illusion that they were sitting beneath a vast star-filled sky. "Wow," Lyle breathed, his face upturned to watch the stars dancing on the ceiling. "It's even better than I remembered." Brimley approached the jar cautiously, batting at one of the light beams with a curious paw, then looking confused when he couldn't catch it. His antics made Lyle giggle, a pure, unself-conscious sound that filled the kitchen like music. "Do you think the other kids at school will like it?" Lyle asked, a hint of his earlier worry returning. "They're going to love it," Harlan assured him. "No one else will have anything like this. And you'll be sharing a real family tradition, something that connects you to your mom and to her dad before her." Lyle nodded, his expression solemn in the starlight. "It's like the light keeps going, even when people don't." The profound simplicity of his son's observation left Harlan momentarily speechless. He pulled Lyle into a hug, holding him close in the constellation-lit kitchen, marveling at the wisdom that could emerge from an 8-year-old's grief and healing. "That's exactly right, buddy," he managed finally. "The light keeps going." The night of the winter celebration arrived clear and cold, stars visible in the real sky above Eldersbrook Elementary School as families trudged through plowed pathways from the parking lot to the festively decorated gymnasium. Harlan carried a cardboard box containing their 5 completed star jars, while Lyle walked beside him, clutching a folder with the written portion of his project, a history of the star jar tradition in their family, complete with photographs and hand-drawn illustrations. Inside the gym, tables had been arranged around the perimeter, each one decorated with a family's winter traditions display. There were gingerbread houses, homemade ornaments, traditional foods from various cultures, photo albums of winter activities, and demonstrations of crafts. The room buzzed with conversation and laughter as families moved from table to table, sharing stories and sampling treats. Ms. Whitman greeted them warmly, showing them to their assigned table. "I'm so looking forward to seeing your project, Lyle," she said, her smile genuine. "You've been so excited about it all week." As they set up their display, arranging the star jars in a semicircle, placing Ayla's original star maps and their new photographs in the center, Harlan noticed Lyle scanning the room, his expression a mixture of anticipation and nervousness. "Everything okay?" he asked quietly. Lyle nodded, but his eyes continued to dart around the crowded gymnasium. I told someone I'd save them a cookie." "From our table?" Harlan blinked in surprise. They hadn't brought cookies or any food for their display, focusing instead on the star jars. Before he could ask for clarification, a familiar voice called Lyle's name, and the boy's face lit up. "Dr. Kesslin!" Lyle waved enthusiastically to the veterinarian, who was making her way through the crowd toward their table. "I made it," she said, slightly breathless, as she reached them. "Sorry I'm late. Had an emergency at the clinic. The St. Bernard with a candy cane stuck in his throat." "Is he okay?" Lyle asked immediately, his concern evident. Dr. Kesslin nodded. "He'll be fine. Candy cane removed, dignity somewhat bruised." She turned to Harlan with a warm smile. "Thanks for inviting me. I've been curious about this project Lyle's been telling me about during Brimley's checkups." Understanding dawned on Harlan. So this was who Lyle had been watching for. He'd invited the veterinarian to see their project. The realization touched him deeply. In the absence of his mother, Lyle had reached out to another caring adult to share in this special moment. "We're just about to do our first demonstration," Harlan told her. "You're right on time." As other families began to gather around their table, drawn by the unusual display, Harlan felt a momentary flutter of anxiety. Public speaking had always been Ayla's strength, not his, but one look at Lyle's eager face bolstered his courage. "Good evening, everyone," he began, his voice steadier than he expected. "Lyle and I are here to share a winter tradition that has been in our family for 3 generations." Lyle stepped forward, his initial shyness giving way to enthusiasm as he explained the concept of star jars and their connection to the winter solstice. He pointed to the photographs of past star jar celebrations, including the ones featuring Ayla, speaking her name naturally and with pride. "My mum learned how to make these from her dad, who was an astronomer," he explained to the attentive crowd. "And now my dad and I are continuing the tradition." When it came time for the demonstration, they turned off the lights in their corner of the gymnasium, and Harlan lit the battery-operated candles inside each jar. Gasps of delight rose from the gathered families as constellations appeared on the walls and ceiling around them. Ursa Major, Cassiopeia, Orion, the Pleiades, and Cygnus the Swan, each rendered in pinpricks of light against the darkness. "It's beautiful," Miss Whitman murmured, her face upturned to watch the stars dancing above them. "The winter solstice is the longest night of the year," Lyle continued, his voice gaining confidence as he spoke the words they'd practiced. "Our star jars help bring back the light and remind us that even in the darkest times the stars are still there, even if we can't always see them." The simple wisdom of this statement, coming from an 8-year-old who had endured such profound loss, brought murmurs of appreciation from the adults in the crowd. Dr. Kesslin caught Harlan's eye over Lyle's head, her expression a mixture of pride and something deeper, understanding, perhaps, of just how far they had come. As the evening progressed, their table became one of the most popular in the gymnasium. Children asked to see the star jars demonstrated again and again, fascinated by the way ordinary mason jars could transform into magical light projectors. Parents asked detailed questions about how to make their own, several jotting down notes or taking pictures of Ayla's original instructions that they'd included in the display. During a quiet moment when most families had moved on to the refreshment table, Dr. Kesslin approached Harlan, her expression thoughtful. "This is a wonderful tradition," she said, "and it seems to mean a great deal to Lyle." Harlan nodded, watching as his son enthusiastically explained the Orion constellation to a younger child. "It's been good for both of us, I think, reconnecting with these memories instead of trying to avoid them." Dr. Kesslin's eyes were kind behind her glasses. "Grief isn't linear, you know. It's more like stars. Sometimes visible, sometimes hidden, but always there, part of the pattern of who we are." The insight struck Harlan as profoundly true. For 2 years, he'd been trying to move past his grief, to get over it, as if it were an obstacle to be overcome. But perhaps it was more like these constellations, a pattern of lights and darks that, seen from the right perspective, formed something meaningful and even beautiful. "Lyle told me about Brimley during his last checkup," Dr. Kesslin continued, "about finding him in the schoolyard, bringing him home in his backpack. He said something that stuck with me, that Brimley helped him remember how to talk about his mom again." Harlan felt his throat tighten with emotion. "That cat has done more for us than I ever could have imagined." "Animals have a gift for that," she agreed. "They meet us exactly where we are, without judgment or expectation. Sometimes that's exactly what a healing heart needs." As the winter celebration drew to a close, Harlan and Lyle carefully packed up their star jars, accepting compliments and answering last-minute questions from lingering families. Ms. Whitman stopped by to tell them that Lyle would be receiving a special recognition certificate for his project at the next school assembly. "Not just for the creativity," she explained, "but for the meaning behind it. For sharing something so personal and turning it into something that touched everyone who saw it." On the drive home, Lyle sat in the back seat, the box of star jars secure beside him, his expression thoughtful in the glow of passing streetlights. "Dad," he said finally, "can we put these jars in the windows at home until the solstice is over?" "I think that's a great idea," Harlan replied. "One for each window facing the street." Lyle nodded enthusiastically. "So other people can see the stars too. Mum would like that, I think." "She would love it," Harlan agreed, his heart full. At home, they found Brimley waiting by the door, his golden eyes gleaming in the darkness. As they arranged the star jars in the front windows, one in the living room, one in the dining room, one in the kitchen, and 2 upstairs in their bedroom windows, the cat followed them from room to room, seemingly fascinated by the patterns of light they created. Later, as Harlan tucked Lyle into bed, the boy's room was bathed in the gentle glow of starlight from the jar on his windowsill. Brimley had already claimed his usual spot at the foot of the bed, his grey form barely visible in the dimness. "Tonight was really good," Lyle murmured sleepily. "I didn't feel sad about Mom not being there. I felt like she kind of was there, in the star jars." Harlan smoothed his son's hair back from his forehead, his heart too full for words. "I felt that too, buddy. And Dr. Kesslin came," Lyle continued, his voice growing drowsier. "She said our tradition was the best one." "She did," Harlan agreed. "That was nice of her to come." Lyle's eyes were drifting closed, but he managed one more observation before sleep claimed him. "She looks at you the way Mom used to sometimes, like she sees something good." The innocent comment caught Harlan off guard. He hadn't thought of Dr. Kesslin. Meredith, he remembered suddenly. Her first name was Meredith in that way, or of any woman since Ayla. The possibility that someone might look at him and see something worthwhile, something beyond his grief and struggle, was both startling and strangely warming. As Lyle's breathing deepened into sleep, Harlan remained sitting on the edge of the bed, watching the star patterns from the jar dance across the ceiling. Brimley stretched and repositioned himself, coming to rest against Lyle's side, his purr a gentle rumble in the quiet room. Outside, the real stars wheeled slowly across the winter sky, following their ancient patterns. Inside, in a house that had been shadowed by grief for too long, new patterns were forming, of healing, of remembrance without pain, of finding ways to carry the past forward into a future that might, against all odds, contain light and warmth again. December marched steadily toward Christmas, bringing with it a fresh blanket of snow that transformed Eldersbrook into a picture-perfect winter wonderland. Main Street was festooned with evergreen garlands and twinkling lights. Shop windows displayed holiday scenes, and the town square boasted a magnificent Norway spruce, decorated by local schoolchildren. For Harlan and Lyle, the approach of the holiday brought mixed emotions. Christmas had been Ayla's favorite celebration. She'd thrown herself into every tradition with characteristic enthusiasm, from baking dozens of cookies to carefully selecting the perfect gifts for everyone on her list. The first Christmas after her death had been a bleak affair that they'd endured rather than celebrated, doing the minimum necessary to acknowledge the day. Last year had been marginally better, but still a pale shadow of the joyful season they'd once known. This year, however, something had shifted. Perhaps it was the success of the Star Jar project which had reconnected them with happy memories of Ayla. Perhaps it was Brimley's presence, bringing new energy to their household. Whatever the cause, Harlan found himself contemplating actual Christmas preparations for the first time in years. On a snowy Saturday, 2 weeks before Christmas, he and Lyle were having breakfast when the boy looked up from his cereal with an unusually determined expression. "Dad, can we get a Christmas tree this year? A real one, like we used to?" The question caught Harlan by surprise. The artificial tree they'd used for the past 2 years, a small pre-lit affair that required minimal effort, was stored in the basement, ready to be assembled. But the look on Lyle's face made him reconsider. "I suppose we could," he said cautiously. "Pearson's Hardware has trees in the lot out back. We could go today if you want." Lyle nodded eagerly. "And could we decorate it with the special ornaments, the ones in the boxes in the attic?" Harlan felt a familiar tightness in his chest at the thought of unpacking the family ornaments, each one laden with memories of Christmases past, of Ayla's delight in unwrapping them each year and telling the stories behind them. But again, his son's hopeful expression made refusal impossible. "Sure," he agreed, trying to match Lyle's enthusiasm. "We'll need to get those boxes down and dust them off." "Can Brimley help decorate?" Lyle asked, glancing at the cat who was perched on the windowsill, watching snowflakes drift past. Harlan laughed, picturing the potential chaos. "I'm not sure help is the right word for what Brimley will do, but he can certainly participate in his own way." After breakfast, they bundled up against the cold and made their way to Pearson's Hardware. The tree lot behind the store was filled with Fraser firs of various sizes, their scent perfuming the crisp winter air. Tom Pearson greeted them warmly, clearly pleased to see them shopping for a real tree. "The Foster men are stepping up their Christmas game this year, I see," he remarked with a friendly wink at Lyle. "Looking for anything special?" "Not too tall," Harlan specified, thinking of their modestly sized living room, "but full and symmetrical, if possible." "I want one that smells really good," Lyle added, his breath forming small clouds in the cold air. "Like the ones Mom used to pick." Tom nodded understandingly and led them to a section of medium-sized trees. These came in from a farm up near Boulder. Best Fraser firs I've seen in years, nice and fresh, good needle retention. They spent nearly an hour examining trees, with Lyle taking his selection responsibility very seriously. Each candidate was thoroughly inspected for fullness, symmetry and fragrance, with Lyle ducking beneath branches to check for bare spots and standing back to evaluate the overall shape. "This one," he finally declared, pointing to a 6-foot tree with even branches and a perfectly straight trunk. "It's just like the one in the picture from when I was 5. Harlan knew exactly which photograph Lyle was referring to, Ayla standing beside their Christmas tree, her arms full of ornaments, laughing at something beyond the camera's frame. It had been one of their last truly happy Christmases before her illness began the following spring. "It's perfect," he agreed, running a hand along the fragrant needles. "This is definitely our tree." Back home, with the tree secured in its stand and watered, they ventured into the attic to retrieve the boxes of decorations. Dust motes danced in the weak winter light, filtering through the small window, as Harlan pulled down cardboard boxes labeled Christmas in Ayla's neat handwriting. Lyle approached the task with reverent care, opening each box slowly, as if unveiling treasures. In many ways they were treasures. Ornaments collected over years of marriage and parenthood, each with its own story. There was the ceramic star Ayla had made in college, the glass ball with Lyle's baby footprint inside, the collection of hand-carved wooden animals from their honeymoon in Vermont, the paper angels Lyle had crafted in kindergarten. To Harlan's surprise, handling these memory-laden objects didn't bring the sharp pain he'd expected. Instead, there was a sweet melancholy, a sense of connection to the past that felt healing rather than harmful. He watched Lyle unwrap each ornament, his small face alight with recognition and remembrance, and felt a wave of gratitude for this moment they were sharing. Brimley, true to his feline nature, found the process fascinating, particularly the tissue paper and ribbon that had protected the more delicate ornaments. He pounced and batted, occasionally disappearing completely into an empty box, only to emerge with paper stuck to his whiskers, prompting laughter from both Harlan and Lyle. As they hung ornaments on the tree, they shared memories of Christmases past, the stories flowing more easily than Harlan would have thought possible. Lyle remembered details that surprised him. The year the star wouldn't light, and Ayla had strung tiny flashlights together as a makeshift topper. The time a mouse had gotten into the stored decorations and made a nest in the nativity scene's manger. The Christmas Eve when it had snowed so hard, they'd had to dig a path to the car for midnight services. By late afternoon, the tree was fully decorated, its branches laden with ornaments that spanned their family history. The mingled sense of fresh pine and cinnamon, from the potpourri Lyle had found in one of the boxes, filled the living room, creating an atmosphere of warmth and festivity that had been absent for too long. "It looks beautiful," Harlan said, stepping back to admire their work. "Best tree we've had in years." "Mom would love it," Lyle declared confidently. And the simple statement, offered without sadness or hesitation, warmed Harlan's heart. Their tree decorating efforts had left them hungry, and Harlan was contemplating dinner options when the doorbell rang, an unusual occurrence, as most of their visitors were neighbors who simply knocked. Brimley, who had finally settled down for a nap beneath the tree, raised his head at the sound, ears pricked with curiosity. Lyle looked equally surprised, pausing in his arrangement of the nativity figures on the coffee table. "Are we expecting someone?" he asked. Harlan shook his head. "Not that I know of." When he opened the door, he was surprised to find Dr. Keslin Meredith standing on the porch, a covered dish in her hands and snowflakes dusting her dark hair. "I hope I'm not intruding," she said, a hint of uncertainty in her normally confident manner. "I was baking for the clinic's holiday party tomorrow and made too much lasagna. I thought you and Lyle might enjoy some." That's very kind of you," Harlan replied, momentarily flustered by her unexpected appearance. "Please come in out of the cold." As she stepped into the entryway, stamping snow from her boots, Lyle appeared in the living room doorway, his face lighting up with recognition. "Dr. Kesslin, we decorated our Christmas tree today, and Brimley helped." Meredith smiled warmly at him. "Did he now? I'd love to see it." At Lyle's enthusiastic invitation, she followed them into the living room where the tree stood in its full glory, twinkling lights reflecting in the ornaments. Brimley had emerged from beneath the lower branches and was approaching cautiously, recognizing his veterinarian but clearly uncertain about this change in context. "Your tree is beautiful," Meredith said, setting the lasagna dish on a side table so she could kneel and greet Brimley, who rubbed against her outstretched hand after a moment's consideration. "And look at you, handsome boy. You're looking so healthy now." As she straightened up, her gaze traveled around the room, taking in the star jars on the windowsills, the nativity scene on the coffee table, and the family photographs on the mantel, including one of Ayla that Harlan had recently brought down from storage, a simple portrait that captured her warm smile and lively eyes. "It feels like Christmas in here," she observed, "warm and festive." "We're trying something new this year," Harlan explained, "getting back to some of our old traditions." Meredith nodded, understanding in her eyes. "That's wonderful. Traditions are important. They connect us to our past while giving us a way to move forward." The simple wisdom of her observation, so similar to what he'd been feeling himself, caught Harlan off guard. He found himself seeing Meredith Kesslin with new eyes, not just as Brimley's veterinarian or a kind community member, but as a woman with her own depth and perspective. Would you like to stay for dinner?" The invitation emerged before he'd fully formed the thought. "Since you brought lasagna anyway, and it's certainly enough for 3. The question seemed to surprise her as much as it did him. "I wouldn't want to impose on your family time." "Please stay," Lyle interjected earnestly. "You can tell us if Brimley is being a good tree guardian. And I want to show you my special ornament collection." Meredith glanced from Lyle's hopeful face to Harlan's, where she must have found encouragement, because after a moment she smiled and nodded. "I'd be delighted then. Thank you." Dinner was surprisingly comfortable. Meredith's lasagna was delicious, with a hint of basil that reminded Harlan of an Italian restaurant he and Ayla had frequented in their dating days. Conversation flowed easily, with Lyle dominating much of it, telling Meredith about their tree selection process, showing her his favorite ornaments, and providing a detailed update on Brimley's adventures since his last checkup. As they ate, Harlan found himself observing Meredith with growing interest. She listened to Lyle with genuine attention, asking thoughtful questions and responding to his stories with warmth and humor. With Harlan, she was equally engaging, sharing anecdotes from the veterinary clinic and discovering mutual connections in their small community that they'd never realized before. "So you've been in Eldersbrook your whole life?" Harlan asked, surprised to learn that she'd grown up just a few streets away from where he and Ayla had bought their house. Meredith nodded. "Except for veterinary school in Fort Collins. I always plan to come back, though. My parents are still here. My dad runs the hardware store in Lyons, and my mum teaches at the community college. I can't believe our paths didn't cross more often before Brimley," Harlan remarked. A shadow passed briefly across Meredith's face. "Well, I was away for a while even after moving back. My husband and I lived in Denver for several years while he worked for a law firm there." She paused, then added simply, "He passed away 5 years ago. Cancer. That's when I came back to Eldersbrook permanently and took over the practice from Dr. Henley." The revelation stunned Harlan. All this time, he'd seen her only as the competent veterinarian who had helped Brimley, never imagining that she might understand loss in the same profound way he did. "I'm so sorry," he said, the words inadequate but sincere. "I had no idea." Meredith's smile was gentle. "It's not something I lead with in conversations. But it does give me some perspective on what you and Lyle have been going through. Different circumstances, of course, but some similar challenges." Lyle, who had been listening quietly to this exchange, spoke up with the directness that only children can manage. "So you know what it's like when people don't come back?" The simple question might have seemed tactless from an adult, but from Lyle it was merely a genuine inquiry, free of pretense or social niceties. "Yes," Meredith answered, matching his directness. "I do know what that's like. It's very hard at first. It gets not easier exactly, but different over time. You find ways to carry them with you." Lyle nodded solemnly, processing this information. "That's what we're doing with Mom, carrying her with us, like with the star jars and the Christmas ornaments." Exactly like that, Meredith agreed. Those are beautiful ways to remember her. After dinner, as Harlan made coffee and Lyle supervised Brimley's evening meal in the kitchen, Meredith wandered to the living room window, where one of the star jars sat on the sill. The early darkness of winter had fallen, and the jar's constellation pattern, Cassiopeia's distinctive W shape, was visible on the glass. "These really are remarkable," she said when Harlan joined her, offering a mug of coffee. "Such a simple concept, but so effective." "Ayla's father was an amateur astronomer," Harlan explained, standing beside her at the window. "He passed that love of the stars on to her, and she was passing it on to Lyle. The star jars were a way of bringing the night sky indoors during the darkest part of winter." Meredith nodded appreciatively. A light in the darkness. We all need that sometimes. Outside, snow had begun to fall again, large flakes drifting lazily past the window. Inside, the warmth of the house, the glow of the Christmas tree, and the unexpected pleasure of shared company created a cocoon of comfort that Harlan hadn't experienced in longer than he could remember. As the evening drew to a close and Meredith prepared to leave, she paused in the entryway, adjusting her scarf against the cold outside. "The town is having its annual holiday stroll on Main Street this Friday evening," she said, a hint of hesitation in her voice. "Shops stay open late, there's caroling, hot chocolate, the whole Norman Rockwell experience. I'm helping with the pet adoption booth for the clinic." She glanced at Lyle, who was listening with interest, then back to Harlan. "Maybe you two would like to come. It's quite festive, and they're lighting the big tree in the square at 7. "Can we, Dad?" Lyle asked immediately, his eyes bright with anticipation. "Could Brimley come too?" Meredith laughed. "I'm afraid Brimley would be happier at home where it's warm and quiet, but they'll have therapy dogs at our booth that you could meet." Harlan found himself nodding before he'd fully considered the invitation. "That sounds like fun. We haven't been to the holiday stroll in a while." The truth was they hadn't attended any town Christmas event since Ayla's death. The prospect was both appealing and slightly daunting, stepping back into community celebrations that would inevitably contain memories of happier times. But Lyle's obvious excitement made the decision easy. "Great," Meredith said, her smile warming her eyes behind her glasses. "The pet adoption booth will be in front of the bookstore. Stop by and say hello if you get a chance." After she'd gone, Harlan stood in the doorway for a moment, watching her car navigate the snowy street with careful precision. An unexpected warmth had settled in his chest, not the sharp, painful heat of grief that had been his constant companion for so long, but something gentler and more hopeful. "I like Dr. Kesslin," Lyle declared as they closed the door against the cold. "She talks to me like I understand things." "She's very kind," Harlan agreed, absently straightening the welcome mat that had been disturbed by their visitor's departure. "And she brought us dinner," Lyle continued, following his father back to the kitchen. "Like Mrs. Wilson used to do after Mom died, except Dr. Kesslin's lasagna was way better." Harlan smiled at his son's forthright assessment. "It was pretty delicious." "And she knows about people not coming back," Lyle added, his tone matter-of-fact rather than sorrowful. "So she understands." This simple observation gave Harlan pause. He'd spent 2 years feeling isolated in his grief, convinced that no one could truly understand what he and Lyle were experiencing. The revelation that Meredith Kesslin had walked a similar path and emerged on the other side with her compassion and joy intact felt like finding an unexpected path through a forest he'd thought impenetrable. Later, after Lyle was in bed, Harlan sat in the living room, watching the lights on the Christmas tree reflect in the window glass. Brimley was curled on the couch beside him, purring contentedly as Harlan absently stroked his grey fur. The house felt different tonight, warmer, more alive. The Christmas decorations certainly contributed to this atmosphere, but Harlan suspected the change went deeper. For the first time in 2 years, their home had hosted laughter, conversation, and a genuine sense of connection with someone outside their small family circle. As he gazed at the tree, his eyes fell on a small ceramic ornament near the top, a delicate angel with outstretched wings that Ayla had bought during her first Christmas with Lyle. She joked that it was her surrogate, keeping watch over her boys even when she couldn't be with them. "What do you think, Ayla?" he whispered to the silent room. "Are we doing okay?" No answer came, of course. But as Brimley stretched and repositioned himself against Harlan's leg, purring more loudly, it was easy to imagine that somewhere, somehow, Ayla was watching over them still, pleased to see them finding their way back to life and light. Outside, snow continued to fall, transforming Eldersbrook into a winter wonderland once again. Inside, in a house that had been shadowed by grief for too long, new possibilities were taking root, tentative and fragile, but real nonetheless. A family that had been broken was finding new ways to be whole. A father and son who had been lost were discovering a path forward, one star jar, one Christmas ornament, one unexpected invitation at a time. Friday evening arrived with perfect winter weather for Eldersbrook's holiday stroll, cold enough for breath to form clouds in the air, but not so bitter that being outdoors was uncomfortable. A light snow had fallen that morning, dusting the town with fresh powder that glistened under the streetlights. As Harlan and Lyle walked hand in hand down Main Street, the transformation of their small town was magical. Storefronts glowed with warm light and festive displays, evergreen garlands wrapped with twinkling lights draped from lampposts. The air carried the mingled scents of pine, cinnamon, and wood smoke, along with the distant sounds of carolers gathering in the town square. "It's so pretty," Lyle breathed, his eyes wide as he took in the scene. "Even prettier than I remembered." Harlan had to agree. They hadn't attended the holiday stroll since before Ayla's illness, nearly 3 years now, and he'd forgotten how thoroughly Eldersbrook embraced the season. Every shop had decorated with its own unique flair. Henderson's general store featured a nostalgic display of vintage toys and candy. The bakery windows were filled with elaborate gingerbread houses. The hardware store had created a winter village, complete with a working model train. "Look, Dad!" Lyle pointed excitedly to a group of people gathered around a fire pit in front of the coffee shop. "They're roasting marshmallows." The simple joy in his son's voice warmed Harlan more effectively than any fire could have. For so long, Lyle had moved through the world with a solemn caution that broke Harlan's heart. To see him excited, engaged, eyes bright with wonder, it felt like a gift beyond measure. "Want to make s'mores?" Harlan suggested, and Lyle nodded eagerly. They joined the group around the fire pit, where Mrs. Abernathy, the coffee shop owner, handed out skewers, marshmallows, graham crackers, and chocolate squares. She greeted them warmly, her weathered face creasing with genuine pleasure. "Harlan and Lyle Foster, what a wonderful surprise. We've missed seeing you at these gatherings." Her simple acknowledgement of their absence, offered without judgment or pity, somehow made it easier to be there. Harlan smiled as he accepted the s'mores ingredients. "It's good to be back," he said, and meant it. As they roasted marshmallows over the crackling fire, Lyle's face aglow in the dancing flames, Harlan was struck by how right this felt, being part of the community again, sharing in this simple celebration. For too long, they'd isolated themselves in their grief. With perfectly golden marshmallows squished between chocolate and graham crackers, they continued their stroll down Main Street. Lyle insisted on stopping at every shop to admire the decorations and sample the treats that many were offering: sugar cookies at the bakery, hot apple cider at the bookstore, caramel corn at the movie theater. As they approached the pet adoption booth set up in front of Pages and Brew, the town's combination bookstore and coffee shop, Harlan felt a flutter of anticipation. Meredith had said she would be there, helping with the animals, and he found himself scanning the crowd for her familiar figure. The booth was decorated with red and green streamers, and a banner proclaiming "Home for the Holidays" hung above several crates containing cats and a pen, where volunteers walked adoptable dogs on short leashes. A small crowd had gathered, children and adults alike clamoring to pet the animals. And there was Meredith, kneeling beside a pen where a golden retriever with a greying muzzle was gently accepting ear scratches from a wheelchair-bound elderly man. She wore a red sweater with a subtle pattern of snowflakes, her dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, and even from a distance, Harlan could see the warmth in her smile. "There's Dr. Kesslin!" Lyle exclaimed, tugging on Harlan's hand to hurry him along. She looked up at the sound of Lyle's voice, her face brightening with recognition. "You made it!" she called, rising to greet them as they approached the booth. "We couldn't miss the therapy dogs," Lyle explained seriously. "Dad said they're specially trained to help people feel better." Meredith nodded, matching his tone. "That's exactly right. Would you like to meet Max? He's our most experienced therapy dog." At Lyle's eager nod, she led them to the golden retriever. explaining that Max visited hospitals, nursing homes and schools, bringing comfort to people of all ages. Under her watchful eye, Lyle gently stroked the dog's soft fur, his expression solemn with concentration. "He's so calm," Lyle observed. "Is that why he's good at helping people?" "That's part of it," Meredith agreed. "He has a gentle soul. He seems to know exactly what each person needs, whether it's playfulness or just quiet companionship. Like Brimley," Lyle declared confidently. "He knows when I'm sad without me saying anything." Meredith's eyes met Harlan's over Lyle's head, a shared understanding passing between them. "Animals often have that gift," she said. "They listen with their hearts." As Lyle continued bonding with Max, Harlan found himself drawn into conversation with Meredith. There was an ease between them that surprised him. No awkward pauses or stilted small talk, just a natural flow of words about the town, the holiday festivities, their shared experiences of Eldersbrook in winter. "The tree lighting should be starting soon," she mentioned, glancing at her watch. "It's quite magical, especially for first-timers." She smiled at Lyle, who was now helping a volunteer show a small child how to approach Max gently. "Or for those rediscovering it." "Would you like to join us?" Harlan asked, the invitation emerging before he'd fully considered it. "For the tree lighting, I mean, if you can get away from the booth." Something flickered in Meredith's eyes, surprise perhaps or pleasure. "I'd love to. My shift ends in 10 minutes, actually." The three of them made their way to the town square as dusk deepened into darkness. The massive Norway spruce stood unlit, but majestic at the center, surrounded by a growing crowd of townspeople. A children's choir had assembled on the steps of the community center, their young voices rising sweet and clear in traditional carols. Lyle, caught up in the festive atmosphere, bounced on his toes with excitement. "When will they light it, Dad? Will there be a countdown?" "Any minute now," Harlan assured him. And yes, everyone counts down together. Mayor Wilson soon appeared on the community center steps, microphone in hand, to welcome everyone to Eldersbrook's annual tree lighting ceremony. After a brief speech, he invited the assembled crowd to join in the countdown. 10, 9, 8. The collective voice of the town rose in anticipation, Lyle's excited shout joining the chorus. 7, 6, 5. Harlan found himself caught up in the moment, his own voice joining the countdown. Beside him, Meredith was counting too, her face upturned to the massive tree, eyes reflecting the ambient light of the square. 4, 3, 2, 1. With a collective gasp of delight, the tree burst into light, thousands of tiny bulbs illuminating its massive form from trunk to star-topped peak. Simultaneously, the lights strung throughout the square and down Main Street blazed to life, transforming Eldersbrook into an enchanted winter wonderland. "Wow," Lyle breathed, his face a study in wonder as he gazed up at the towering tree. "It's like the biggest star jar ever." The innocent observation brought laughter from both Harlan and Meredith, and in that moment of shared joy, something shifted subtly between them. When their eyes met over Lyle's head, Harlan felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the crowds or the season, a connection that was both new and somehow familiar. As the choir launched into "Oh Christmas Tree," Lyle surprised them both by spontaneously reaching out to take Meredith's hand as well as Harlan's, creating a small chain of connection. If she was startled by the gesture, she didn't show it, simply giving Lyle's hand a gentle squeeze as they stood together, three figures among many, joined in celebration of light in the darkness. Later, as they strolled back down Main Street, Lyle spotted a booth selling hot chocolate and dashed ahead, weaving through the crowd with the agility of youth. "He seems so much better," Meredith observed, watching him go. "There's a lightness to him now that wasn't there when you first brought Brimley in." Harlan nodded, grateful for her perception. "He's coming back to himself, little by little." The cat helped, but so did the star jars. And being here tonight, connecting with the community again instead of hiding away at home. "Grief is isolating," Meredith said quietly. "After David died, my husband, I became something of a hermit. Went to work, came home, repeat. It took my mother practically dragging me to a community potluck to get me out of that pattern." The simple sharing of her experience touched Harlan deeply. "For us it was a grey cat in a school backpack," he said with a small smile. Strange how healing arrives in unexpected packages. As the evening drew to a close, the crowd beginning to thin as families with young children headed home, they found themselves back near the pet adoption booth, which was now being packed up for the night. "I should help them finish," Meredith said, a note of reluctance in her voice, "but I've had a wonderful time with you both." "We have too," Harlan replied, meaning it deeply. Lyle, who had been watching a volunteer load cat carriers into a van, turned to Meredith with his characteristic directness. "Are you coming to our house for Christmas? We're getting a ham from Mr. Peterson's store, and Dad said we might make cookies like Mom used to." The unexpected invitation hung in the air between the adults, Harlan momentarily speechless at his son's bold social move. Meredith looked equally surprised, her eyes widening slightly behind her glasses. "Oh, That's very kind, Lyle, but I wouldn't want to intrude on your family time," she said carefully, glancing at Harlan as if seeking guidance. Finding his voice, Harlan stepped in. "You wouldn't be intruding at all," he assured her, the words feeling right as he spoke them. "We'd love to have you join us if you don't have other plans, nothing fancy, just dinner and maybe some games afterward. And Brimley will be there," Lyle added, clearly considering this a significant selling point. "He's never had Christmas before, so we're getting him a special toy." Meredith's expression softened, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "Well, I can't miss Brimley's first Christmas, can I?" She looked at Harlan, something warm and questioning in her gaze. "If you're sure I wouldn't be in the way." "We're sure," Harlan and Lyle replied in unison, then looked at each other in surprise before breaking into laughter. "Then I accept," Meredith said, her smile broadening. "Thank you." Walking home hand in hand with Lyle through the snow-dusted streets of Eldersbrook, the holiday lights glowing around them like earthbound stars, Harlan found himself thinking of Ayla, not with the sharp pain that had characterized his memories for so long, but with a gentler ache tinged with gratitude for the years they'd shared, the son they'd created together, the love that had shaped him into the man he was now. "Do you think Mom would be happy about Dr. Kesslin coming for Christmas?" Lyle asked suddenly, his breath forming small clouds in the cold air. The question gave Harlan pause, not because it was difficult to answer, but because Lyle had posed it with such straightforward simplicity. "I think she would," Harlan replied after a moment's reflection. "Your mom always believed that Christmas was about sharing with others, making sure no one was alone during the holidays." Lyle nodded, his face thoughtful in the glow of the streetlights. "I think she'd like Dr. Kesslin," he declared finally, with the certainty of childhood, "because she listens like Mom did, and she doesn't act like we're broken." The simple wisdom of this observation caught Harlan off guard. It was true. Meredith Kesslin had never treated them with the careful pity that characterized so many interactions since Ayla's death. She saw them clearly, acknowledged their loss without defining them by it, and engaged with them as whole people capable of joy as well as sorrow. "You're right," he agreed, giving Lyle's hand a squeeze. "That's a pretty important quality in a friend." Christmas Eve arrived with perfect storybook weather, large, lazy snowflakes drifting past the windows, coating Eldersbrook in a fresh blanket of white. Inside the Foster home, preparations for the holiday were in full swing. The scent of gingerbread filled the kitchen, Christmas music played softly from the stereo, and colourful paper and ribbons covered the dining room table, where Lyle was wrapping last-minute gifts with intense concentration. Brimley supervised from his perch on a nearby chair, occasionally batting at stray ribbons when they came within reach. The cat had adapted to the holiday decorations with typical feline selectivity, ignoring the Christmas tree entirely after an initial inspection, but developing a passionate interest in the nativity scene, from which the baby Jesus figure had to be repeatedly rescued. "Dad?" Lyle called from the dining room. "How do you spell veterinarian?" Harlan smiled to himself, suspecting the reason for the question. "Veterinarian. But you could just write Dr. Kesslin, if that's easier." "No, I want to do it right," Lyle insisted, his tongue between his teeth as he carefully printed on a gift tag. "It's her job, so it should be on her present." The gift in question was a hand-crafted ornament, a small wooden star that Lyle had painted blue and covered with tiny silver dots, representing constellations, with a loop of ribbon for hanging. They'd found the blank wooden shapes at Henderson's general store, and Lyle had spent hours decorating this one for Meredith, determined to create something that connected to their family tradition of star jars. "I made one for Mom too," he said after a moment, his voice matter-of-fact. "Can we hang it on the tree tonight before we go to church?" The simple request caught Harlan off guard. They hadn't discussed attending the Christmas Eve service at Eldersbrook Community Church, something that had been an annual tradition during Ayla's life, but that they'd avoided since her death. The midnight service, with its candles and carols, had always been Ayla's favorite part of Christmas. "You want to go to the service?" Harlan asked carefully. Lyle nodded, still focused on aligning the edges of the wrapping paper. "Ms. Whitman said they're doing the candle thing again, where everyone holds a light at the end. Mum always liked that part best." He looked up, his expression earnest. "And I think we should go, because we have star jars now, and it's kind of the same thing, bringing light to the dark." The wisdom in this observation, connecting their rekindled family tradition to the broader spiritual symbolism of the season, left Harlan momentarily speechless. How had his 8-year-old son arrived at an understanding that had eluded him for 2 years? That traditions were not just painful reminders of what was lost, but bridges to what remained. "You're right," he said finally. "We should go. Your mum would like that." Lyle smiled, a quick flash of relief and pleasure before returning to his wrapping task. Brimley, sensing the emotional shift in the room, abandoned his chair to weave around Harlan's ankles, purring loudly. The rest of the day passed in a flurry of activity. Final decorations hung, presents arranged under the tree, preparations made for tomorrow's dinner. At dusk, they gathered in the living room for what Lyle had declared was an essential pre-Christmas ritual, the official hanging of special ornaments. First came the one Lyle had made for Ayla, a star similar to Meredith's but painted deep purple with gold constellation marks. As Harlan lifted his son to hang it on a high branch near the star at the top of the tree, he felt a curious peace settle over him. There was sadness, yes, but not the crushing grief that had once made such moments unbearable. "Perfect," Lyle declared as the ornament caught the light, sending tiny reflections dancing across the ceiling. "Now Mum can see the whole tree from up there." After Ayla's ornament was in place, they hung another special addition, a small grey cat figure that Harlan had found at the holiday stroll. Hand-painted to resemble Brimley, complete with the distinctive white marking on his face, it captured the alert curiosity of their feline family member. "Brimley has his own ornament," Lyle exclaimed with delight. "Now he's officially part of the family Christmas." The church was packed when they arrived, the pews filled with familiar faces from around Eldersbrook. Several people nodded or smiled in greeting as they made their way to a spot near the back. Not their old regular place near the front, but a compromise that felt manageable for this first return. The service was both familiar and new, the same carols and readings that had marked Christmas Eve for generations, but heard now through the filter of their changed lives. When the congregation sang Silent Night, Lyle leaned against Harlan's side, his small voice joining the hundreds of others filling the sacred space. At the end of the service came the moment Lyle had been waiting for, the candle lighting. Each person received a small candle, and the minister lit the first one from the Advent wreath. That light was then passed from person to person, candle to candle, until the entire church glowed with hundreds of individual flames. As the organist played softly and the congregation sang Joy to the World, Harlan looked down at his son's face, illuminated by candlelight, his expression solemn and wondering. In that moment, he saw both Ayla and himself reflected in Lyle's features, their love embodied in this small person who was finding his way through grief with such courage and wisdom. When they emerged from the church shortly after midnight, the snow had stopped and the sky had cleared to reveal a canopy of stars, brilliant points of light in the vast darkness above Eldersbrook. Lyle tilted his head back, his breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. "Look, Dad," he whispered, pointing upward. "Ursa Major, just like in our star jar." The memory came back clearly. Warm summer nights in the backyard, Ayla pointing out constellations while Lyle, much younger then, nestled in her lap, his eyes wide with wonder as she described celestial bears and hunters, queens and heroes, all mapped in the lights above. Inside their home, they found Brimley waiting by the door, his whiskers twitching with interest as they stamped snow from their boots in the entry. The cat followed them into the living room, where the Christmas tree lights cast a warm glow across the familiar space. Christmas morning brought with it the simple joys of the season, Lyle's excitement over presents, Brimley's fascination with discarded wrapping paper, the comforting aromas of breakfast casserole and coffee filling the kitchen. By afternoon, the house was ready for their guest, with the dining table set with Ayla's holiday dishes, brought down from high cupboards where they'd been stored unused for 2 years. Meredith arrived promptly at 4, bearing a homemade apple pie and a small gift bag. She'd traded her usual practical work clothes for a festive sweater in deep green, and her dark hair fell loose around her shoulders instead of in its typical ponytail. "Merry Christmas," she greeted them warmly as Harlan took her coat. "Something smells wonderful." "Dad made ham and scalloped potatoes," Lyle informed her, barely containing his excitement. "And we have pie too, but yours looks way better." On cue, Brimley appeared in the hallway, approaching with his typical blend of caution and curiosity. To everyone's surprise, he went directly to Meredith, rubbing against her ankles with a loud purr. The meal that followed was filled with easy conversation and laughter. Lyle regaling Meredith with stories of his school's holiday concert, Meredith sharing amusing anecdotes from the veterinary clinic's pet photos with Santa event, Harlan discovering that they shared a love of old Christmas movies and a mutual dislike of fruitcake. After dinner came presents, with Lyle serving as official distributor. Brimley's catnip toy was an immediate hit, the normally dignified cat rolling and pouncing with abandoned enthusiasm, much to Lyle's delight. Meredith's gift bag contained thoughtfully selected presents for each of them: a set of constellation-patterned note cards for Harlan, a children's book about veterinary medicine for Lyle, and a plush mouse with a bell inside for Brimley. But it was Lyle's hand-painted star ornament that clearly touched her most deeply. "You made this?" she asked, turning the small wooden star in her hands, admiring the carefully painted constellations. Lyle nodded proudly. "It's like our star jars, but you can take it home and hang it on your tree. See, that's Cassiopeia in the middle, the queen who was put in the stars." "It's beautiful," Meredith said, her voice slightly husky with emotion. "I'll treasure it always." "Thank you, Lyle." As the evening progressed, they moved to the living room where Harlan built a fire in the fireplace, while Lyle set up the board game he'd received that morning, a strategy game involving wildlife conservation that seemed perfectly suited to their veterinarian guest. Brimley claimed a spot on the hearthrug, his golden eyes half-closed in contentment as he watched the humans play. Later, after Lyle had gone to bed, Harlan and Meredith sat by the fire, mugs of hot chocolate in hand. Outside, snow had begun to fall again, large flakes drifting past the windows where the star jars cast their constellation patterns onto the glass. "Thank you for including me today," Meredith said softly. "It's been the loveliest Christmas I've had in years." "We should be thanking you," Harlan replied. "For everything. For saving Brimley. For your kindness to Lyle. For seeing us as whole people, not just as a tragedy." She met his gaze directly, her eyes reflecting the firelight. "That's how I needed to be seen after David died. Not as a victim or a charity case, but as someone still capable of joy, still part of the world." She paused, then added, "Grief changes us, but it doesn't define us. At least it shouldn't. Lyle said something interesting last night," he found himself saying. "He said you make me smile more, like I used to with Ayla." Meredith's expression softened, a hint of vulnerability showing through her usual composure. "And how did that make you feel when he said that?" Harlan considered the question carefully. Surprised, at first, then grateful, and not guilty, which was itself surprising. He met her eyes directly. "Ayla would want us to be happy, to live fully, not just exist. That's who she was, someone who embraced life with both arms." They sat in companionable silence for a while, watching the fire and listening to the subtle sounds of the house at night. The tick of the mantel clock, the occasional creak of a floorboard as Brimley prowled the hallway, the soft hiss of snow against the windows. "I should probably go," Meredith said finally. "The roads will be getting slippery with the fresh snow." "You could stay," Harlan suggested impulsively, then clarified quickly at her raised eyebrows. "I mean, we have a guest room, if you'd rather not drive in this weather." The invitation hung between them, laden with unspoken possibilities, not just for this night, but for the future. They were two people who had experienced profound loss, who understood grief's terrain, who had found their way back to joy against considerable odds. "Thank you," Meredith said after a moment, her smile gentle. "But I think I'll head home tonight. My neighbor is watching my ancient cat, Jasper, and he gets anxious if I'm gone too long. She paused, then added, but I'd like a rain check. For another time. The promise in those simple words, another time, filled Harlan with quiet hope. Not a desperate grasping at happiness, but a patient openness to possibilities that might unfold naturally, in their own time. After she'd gone, Harlan stood for a moment on the porch, watching her taillights disappear down the snowy street. The night was quiet, the world transformed by fresh snow into something clean and new and full of possibility. Inside, he found Brimley waiting in the hallway, golden eyes gleaming in the darkness. The cat accompanied him on a final check of the house, doors locked, fire safely screened, star jars glowing in the windows. This was healing in its purest form, not forgetting, not moving on as if the past could be left behind, but incorporating their loss into a life that continued, that expanded to include both grief and joy, both memory and new experience. Sometimes, Harlan reflected as he prepared for sleep, the most profound healings arrive in the most ordinary packages. A stray cat in a school backpack, a star jar on a windowsill, a child's laughter returned after too long an absence, a Christmas dinner shared with a new friend. Outside, snow continued to fall on Eldersbrook, covering the familiar landscape in a blanket of pristine white. Inside, in a house warmed by more than just its furnace, a broken family slept peacefully, their healing incomplete but undeniably underway. A father, a son, and a cat who had found them when they needed him most. 3 hearts beating in the darkness, creating their own constellation of connection and care.